Carl Finds a Home. A Wilma and Carl story. Written by Havelah McLat. Illustrated by Rocco DeCaro. One evening in the forest, there was a black cat passing through. The cat stopped because she was tired and weary. She found a tree with a hoe. She peeked inside and saw it was covered in rusty leaves. After stepping inside, she observed and circled a few times and then lay down to rest. Hours later, the cat was no longer alone. She birthed a litter of newborn kittens. One had a white and black coat, the second just white, and the last much like her. She licked them till they were dry and clean. Shortly after that, the mother cat noticed one wasn't crawling like the others. Two crawled and snuggled against her stomach and drank milk. She glanced closely at him. He was shivering, and the mother moved and brought him closer to her and the others. But he wasn't eating. The mother grew worried. She purred and didn't know what to do. She touched his nose, and he didn't look up. She stood up and carried him as any mother cat would do. She feared he was sick and needed help. She ran out to find someone. The mother wandered around and suddenly noticed a glow in the forest. She followed it. When she did, she could see light coming from inside the cottage. Once she approached the door, she gently laid him down and began scratching on the door. At the same time, she cried. Then the door cracked open, and the mother stopped crying and fled. The person who opened the door was a young girl. But she wasn't an ordinary girl, she was a witch. Her parents were visiting a friend in another village. When she glanced around and looked down, she covered her face. She gasped. It was a kitty. She bends down and saw how sick he looked. Her heart ached for this kitty. She picked him up and brought him inside. After tending him with special care, the kitty slowly recovered. Wilma named him Carl. A few days became weeks and turned into months. Carl was no longer a baby. He grew to an average-sized cat. One day, while Wilma was out of town, Carl woke up from his nap and stretched his body. He suddenly saw something creeping across the floor to another room. He jumped from the chair to find it. Walking in the room, he glanced around. This room was the place Wilma did her experiments with magic. Much of her magic was harmless, and she only used them for good purposes. Sometimes he got a little fussy and worried about things she did. When Wilma wasn't around, Carl made sure nobody got into her things. About the same time, he paused. His whiskers winked. His ears perked. He could hear something. Carl spun around and saw a creature with a long tail. It was a nasty rat. He held out his claws and then chased after it. Before he caught him, the ugly rat jumped up onto the table and stood beside the bottles. Carl hissed because those were important to Wilma. They were formulas she created. As soon as Carl took a huge leap, the rat pushed the bottle with his tail. The rat fled before Carl could attack him. Then he heard Wilma calling his name. "Carl, is that you?" Carl jumped off and quickly licked up the mess. When he did that, Wilma entered the room. Carl turned his eyes to her. From the look on her face, he could tell she didn't look happy. Wilma shook her head and frowned. "How many times have I told you not to jump and break things?" she asked. Then, for the first time, he opened his mouth and spoke. "I didn't do it!" Wilma's eyes widened. "Did you speak?" Carl looked puzzled, not realizing at first he could talk. "Did I?" Wilma laughed and said, "I guess one of my formulas gave you the ability to speak." "I didn't mean to," he said. "An ugly rat dropped your bottles and I stopped him, but he got away." Wilma picked him up in her arms and hugged him. "Wilma, you aren't mad at me?" he asked. Wilma glanced at him. "I was, but not anymore." "But your Carl," Wilma interrupted. "I can make more. I'm glad you guarded my things." Carl smiled big. He was glad to be Wilma's cat. The end. Fireflies in the Night, a Wilma and Carl story, written by Havelah McLat, illustrated by Rocco DeCaro. One evening, Wilma and Carl arrived back home after shopping in the village. At that moment, a loud burst of thunder startled them. They looked up and the whole sky was covered in darkness and lightning appeared before their eyes. Quickly, they rushed inside and Wilma shut the door. "Whew," she said in a huge sigh of relief. Carl jumped on a chair by the window and gazed outside it. His hair spurred up after another lightning strike and rain poured heavily from the sky. "Geez, someone is sure dumping a bucket of water today," Carl said, stepping away from the window. Wilma put her broom away and carried her bag. Before leaving the room, she patted Carl's head. "Now you don't have to worry. I'm sure this storm will pass before we know it." Wilma was right. The storm ended and she opened the window to let cool breeze in. For the last few days, the weather had been sultry. The heavy rain brought coolness. Carl was about to curl himself up when something appeared in front of him. He held still as it landed right on his nose. It wasn't any smaller than the size of a sunflower seed. Shaking his head, the little fly didn't move. "Can't you see I'm trying to get some sleep?" Carl said to the fly. Wilma was in the other room, so she wasn't there to see him and the fly. Carl sighed, and suddenly, the fly lit up with glowing light. His eyes widened. The glowing fly took off and flew through the window to the forest. Carl hurried after it and jumped out of the window to follow it. Suddenly, Carl stopped in awe as he was surrounded by twinkling lights and his friend came back to him. Meanwhile, Wilma brought Carl's dinner to the room. She looked around and he was nowhere to be seen. "Carl, I don't have time to play hide and seek," she said in a serious tone. "Come out wherever you are." Wilma gasped and realized Carl must have snuck out through the open window. She ran outside to search for him. "Where could he be?" Wilma wondered, glancing around the forest. She couldn't see much in the dark except for a bunch of bright green lights twinkling around the forest. Pulling out her wand, Wilma magically transformed it into a flashlight. "Carl, I can't believe you wandered off." She stopped as she noticed something moving by the bushes. She couldn't tell if it was Carl and took a closer look. At the same time, she heard a familiar voice talking. "Carl?" she said. "Wilma?" the voice said. Wilma lowered her flashlight. She saw glowing eyes. It was Carl! Nobody had glowing eyes as big as his. Carl jumped into Wilma's arms. "I was so worried," she said with a sigh of relief. Carl looked up at her. "I was strongly captivated by glowing flies." "Ah, you were in awe by the fireflies," Wilma said, smiling. Carl nodded upon learning the real name of the glowing flies. As they turned back to head home, the fireflies twinkled and lit a path leading them there. The end.